Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun. I'm JT, and in this video we're going to be talking all about RAW versus JPEG and what file format you should be shooting with your camera. We're going to break down both JPEG and RAW, what works best for different applications in photography, and be sure to stick around till the end of the video because we're going to be taking a RAW file and a JPEG file, doing a little bit of editing, some retouching, and kind of tweaking those files to see which one holds up the best and which one is best for you to be shooting. So let's hop right into this video. So there are many people out there that feel very strongly about shooting either RAW or JPEG, or some cameras shoot both RAW and JPEG depending on what exactly you're shooting with. So before we jump into the pros and the cons of JPEG and RAW and what you should be shooting, let's define both of those file formats and talk a little bit about each of them for some of our beginners out there. So first of all, let's talk about JPEG. JPEG is known as a lossy, compressed file format. That means your camera, when it creates a JPEG image, is squeezing this file and squeezing this data down. And when it does that squeezing and compressing that image size and that file size down to a smaller size, you are losing a little bit of data. And again, that depends on your camera and the settings you have. We'll get into that here in a minute. When you're shooting a RAW format or a RAW file, your camera is taking all of that raw data straight off the sensor, basically, and it's giving you that whole file, and it's usually a larger file, and it's usually known as lossless. So when it does compress that file and squish it down a little bit to fit more of those files on your memory card, you are not losing data. So let's jump into some of the pros and the cons of shooting RAW or shooting JPEG, and let's start off first talking about file size. RAW, as we talked about a second ago, you are getting so much data, usually a 10, 12, or 14-bit file, which means there's a lot of color data in there and a lot of data to make edits later on. You are getting all of that data in a big file. That file can be 20 megabytes, 30 megabytes, 50 megabytes, depending on the actual megapixel count of your sensor and how many megapixels is in your final image. JPEG, on the other hand, again, as we talked about, is much more compressed. You are losing some of that data, but you're looking at file sizes closer to 1 or 2 megabytes, maybe 10 megabytes on the very high end. So as you can guess, RAW is going to be a lot heavier on your hard drive, on your memory cards, versus JPEG. You're going to be able to fit a lot more JPEG images on your memory card and take a lot more photos. These days, I find that a lot less of an issue because memory cards are huge. Hard drives are actually huge. They're massive multi-terabyte hard drives. The card I have in my camera right now is probably 120 gigs, and I can fit thousands and thousands of RAW photos and thousands of JPEGs, of course. But I'm not worried about file size, and as a photographer, file storage is getting so cheap these days. It's not really something that you have to worry about like maybe you did 10 years ago. So I definitely recommend, if you're thinking about file size as whether you should be shooting RAW versus JPEG, I recommend shooting RAW for that data. And again, storage is cheap these days. So moving right along, let's talk about that file info and that data we just talked about a second ago. We will be diving deeper into this in the end of the video when we bring up our RAW and our JPEG files, so be sure to stick around for that. As I mentioned before, RAW files are larger because they contain more data. JPEGs are smaller because they've been compressed down, and they do contain less data. Your RAW image is your light that hits the sensor and is made into a file, whereas your JPEG is your light hits your sensor. It is processed more heavily. Any sort of look or color style that you're looking at through your camera in your little LCD viewfinder, that is stamped into your image, that is baked into your image, and that is there forever. It's providing a look to your image, which at first glance usually looks a little bit better than a RAW image, which typically looks a little flatter until it's edited. We'll get into that here in a minute. But again, that image data is compressed, it's squished, and it is a lot less editable with a JPEG versus a RAW. With a raw image, I have all of this data. I can do pretty massive edits to my exposure, to my white balance, to my sharpness. We'll get into that here in a second. And all sorts of color edits that I can do to my raw file that I can't necessarily do to my JPEG file because that data is not there. That data is lost forever in that lossy compressed format when it is squished down to that JPEG file. You will also notice with a raw image, when you open it in your editor, next to a JPEG image, it is going to be a lot sharper. That is a huge difference I noticed personally when I started shooting raw instead of JPEG, or raw with JPEG, is that my raw files are so much sharper. JPEG with compression and losing that data, squishing that data down into a smaller file, your images are not going to be as sharp, and that is just a property of JPEG and your raw. So we talked a little bit about the ability to post-process or edit your images after you've taken them. Let's talk a little bit about file sharing. It's a little bit more difficult to share raw files than it is for you to share JPEG files. JPEG is just such a universal format. It's easy for me to take an image on my camera or my phone as a JPEG and easily share it over Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or email and give that to someone else on a phone, a camera, or a laptop and have them easily open it in so many different programs that you can open images with. Whereas on the other hand, RAW is a little bit more difficult. You need a dedicated editor. Macs have gotten a little bit better with that spacebar preview. You can now preview a lot of different RAW files on a Mac, where that's in the past wasn't always an option. I used to shoot JPEG just so I could see a quick preview before I opened my RAW file. Now on a Mac, I can hit spacebar, preview that RAW file, and I really don't even need to shoot JPEGs for that preview file necessarily anymore. So overall, it is much easier to share a JPEG than it is a RAW file, not only for file size, but for compatibility. Even when you're using your RAW format on your phone, I believe it's HEIC, that can be difficult to share even natively with phones and then having to open that up in some other different software. It's so much easier to share a JPEG. The quickest way around sharing a RAW file is usually to open it in your editor like Lightroom or Photoshop, make your quick edits, export as a JPEG, and then send over, again, that compressed JPEG versus your heavy raw file. So when it comes to that sharing and shareability, it is much easier to share a JPEG than a raw file. So another point I wanted to really drive home was that image sharpness. We touched on it in a minute, and we'll see it again when we open up our raw and JPEG files on our computer. But that image sharpness, that really hits home when you bring up those two files at 100% or 200%. It makes a huge difference with that sharpness. Now this is especially true in portraits. As you all know, I love shooting portraits. I love low light portraits. And to shoot those low light portraits, I have to really open up my aperture and use a very shallow depth of field. So focus and sharpness is critical. That's why I really rely on raw images to get that focus dead on, tack sharp, and I don't want that compressed in my JPEG image. I want that raw data, that raw sharpness, that uncompressed image to really see that sharpness in my subject's eyes. Because, quick pro tip here, when your eyes are in focus, your portrait is in focus. So that's what really makes the difference for me when I'm thinking about whether I want to shoot raw or JPEG. I am always going for that raw file, especially if I'm shooting portraits. So the last point I want to bring up here is FPS, or frames per second. Now, this is an ever-changing thing because cameras are continuously getting faster and faster. There are multiple processors in cameras now which allow your camera to process your images and take them from your sensor to your memory card faster and faster with each generation of cameras that comes out. So this really is becoming a non-issue. I would say 10, maybe 15 years ago with older digital cameras, DSLRs, if you really wanted your camera's fastest performance, you would have to shoot JPEG because those images processed a lot faster, they were more compressed, they made it from your sensor to your memory card a lot faster. Whereas if you were shooting large raw files, you would be limited to maybe a couple raw shots per second, whereas JPEG, you would probably be able to shoot 2 or 3 times as fast. Also, camera's buffers would fill up. The little bit of memory in your camera that's used to process that photo would fill up faster if you're shooting a lot of RAW photos per second versus JPEG photos per second. But again, I say that really becomes a non-issue these days as cameras get faster and faster. We can shoot RAW images so fast these days, 10, 12, 14, 20 frames per second, and it just keeps getting faster. So again, RAW still wins out in my opinion, even in this frames per second argument that some people like to dive into. It's still very, very lightning fast to shoot RAW images, even if you're shooting street photography, journalism related photography, or sports is where that really comes in handy. That panning, shooting dozens of shots and seeing what comes out using a continuous high shooting mode. But again, RAW, you can shoot so many frames per second. In my opinion, and for my job, it's really a non-issue at this point with the great technology that we have. So with all that being said, let's jump into our editor. We'll open up a RAW file, we'll open up a JPEG, do some minor edits. We'll look at these photos at 100 and 200%, and we'll see if you can tell the difference between that RAW file and that JPEG file. And ultimately, by the end of this video, decide what is the best for you to be shooting. Okay, so let's compare a RAW and a JPEG image next to each other side by side. So I did a photo shoot not too long ago up in the mountains of Colorado. I found this really nice lake, a little barn, that gorgeous reflection of the mountains, just a little bit of snow up there. And I had my camera set to capture RAW and JPEG so I can actually do a comparison of RAW and JPEG side by side. So you can see these are the same image. You can see DSC 1555 JPEG and DSC 1555 NEF because I shot on a Nikon Z6, and I am just using the preview option on my Mac. So you can just hit spacebar to open and close a quick preview of your images. So again, here is the RAW, and here is the JPEG. It's noticeable the amount of color, and there's a little bit of extra contrast, and at first glance, that JPEG actually looks a little bit better, doesn't it? Let's go again back to the RAW, a little bit flat and lacking color, and we go back to the JPEG, and it actually looks a little bit better than the RAW at first glance, and that's because, again, we talked about before, your image profile or color profile is baked right into your JPEG image, and I cannot change that. I cannot do a lot of editing to this JPEG because that data is lost and it has been baked into the image. Kind of like baking a cake, you can't take the ingredients back out once you've baked it. Whereas RAW, it's kind of like I have those raw ingredients. And what we're going to do is we're going to open these up both in Adobe Camera Raw, and we're going to take a look at both these images, kind of push them to their limits a little bit, do a little bit of post-processing, and actually see which one really looks better when we open them up to, let's say 100%, 200%, really zoom into those details, check out that sharpness, and play with our color a little bit. First of all, let's check out the file size. Remember we said RAW and JPEG have different file sizes. We're just going to hit Command-I on our Mac, and we're going to take a look at these file sizes for the JPEG and the RAW. So here you can see our NEF file is 34.4 megabytes and our JPEG is 8.3 megabytes. Again, the JPEG much smaller. Both of these images are the same resolution, 6048 by 4024, but obviously the JPEG has been much more compressed, does not contain as much data as our 34 megabyte RAW file. So let's go ahead and open these up in Adobe Camera Raw and do a little bit of post-processing. So we have Adobe Camera Raw open, and you can see this is Camera Raw version 12.2, and I just bring that up because some people have asked in the comments before. That's why sometimes your Camera Raw looks just a little bit different from mine. Sometimes we have different versions, but don't worry, all of the tools are basically identical. So here's our JPEG image, and here's our RAW image, our NEF. And now you'll notice something a little bit different. Now our RAW image is a little more contrasty, it looks pretty good, and our JPEG image is the image that looks a little bit flat. Why is that? Well, now our editor, Adobe Camera Raw, has applied a treatment or a profile to our RAW image, and we have different options over here to our right of different treatments or color profiles we can apply to our image. They give us different looks here. You can see which one looks a little bit better. Landscape usually looks pretty good on high contrast, high saturation landscape images. I also like Adobe Vivid for landscape. That looks pretty good. And portrait usually works pretty good for human skin tones and portraits. But for now, let's go ahead. Let's just set this back to standard. That is the closest profile to our JPEG right now, just for a quick comparison. So again, you can see our JPEG now is the flatter looking image, and we would have to add some contrast to make it look nice. But again, there's only so much editing we can do to a JPEG without it completely falling apart. Seeing the compression, and again, JPEGs are not as sharp and they don't hold the same tonal values as a raw image. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually do some quick edits to this raw image, and then we'll apply them to our JPEG image and see how they look. So I might apply just a touch of dehaze. This image is a little bit overexposed, and what's great about raw is I can bring that exposure down. That looks much nicer. I can bring those highlights down. Our highlights were a bit bright. Bring these shadows up just a touch, bring out some of this detail in the shadow. Again, you'll see we can't do that as much with our JPEG image. Let's crush these shadows and darker tones a little bit. Again, these tones are looking great. I love the contrast. Add just a little bit of pop to those whites. That looks pretty good. And our white balance is a little bit warm. I'm going to go with 5500. That looks pretty darn good. And maybe make that vibrance pop just a touch. That looks pretty great. Now I'm going to sync our settings with our JPEG image here. Right click, sync settings. All of that looks good. Hit OK. And we'll take a look at our JPEG. That does not look very good. It looks mushy. The colors look kind of off. I'm not a huge fan. So again, here's our raw image. That looks great. I love the tones. Pay attention over here to the left-hand side of the image, these shadows, and then the mountains over here. See, we don't have a lot of detail here in the shadows. It doesn't look great. There's a weird yellowing color to these mountains, and it's just a byproduct of changing our color temperature on a JPEG image. The image just starts to fall apart a little bit because that detail really isn't there. So let's go ahead, let's zoom in to 100%. Let's actually go into 200%. We'll do the same thing with our raw image. Zoom into these mountains to 200%. And we'll take a look back and forth. Here's our JPEG image. There's a weird yellow in the highlights that I'm not a huge fan of. You can see over here that our snow is just completely lost and blown out. If we take a look at our raw image, the tones, the color reproduction just looks better. Again, going back and forth. Let's take a look down here at these trees, these shadows. Again, this is our raw image. And here's our JPEG. Just flat, washed out in the JPEG, and a lot of that detail is just lost in the shadows. Whereas it's much richer and looks so much better here in the shadows in our raw image. Let's go over, let's take a look at the sky and the mountains over here in the raw. And again, I will let you use your eyes and make the judgment for yourself. I'm really going to be looking at these rocks and the tones in the rocks here. The JPEG just kind of looks crummy. Let's see if I can overcorrect this JPEG. We'll cool it down just a touch. It's just I don't have the latitude that I want to be able to work with this color balance in our JPEG image, so it will never look quite correct. Let's add a little contrast to this JPEG to make it look a little bit better. But again, what I can do with the raw, it's amazing. I can really turn down my highlights if they're too bright and overexposed. Can turn down my exposure and just pay attention to some of the highlights in this image. As I turn down my exposure, there's still detail here in the barn, there's still detail in the rocks. Nothing is necessarily blown out or lost, and you can see that as well in my histogram up here. Nothing is clipped in my highlights. Let's take a look at my JPEG. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to turn down our exposure, and it just looks flat and mushy, again, compared to our raw image. The colors are starting to look funky. I'm starting to see these banding lines in the sky. That's called JPEG compression. And I don't see that at all in our raw image. No JPEG compression because, again, it is uncompressed. Or if it is compressed, it is a lossless compression. And I'm not getting that banding in the sky in any sort of gradients. And it doesn't look terrible like the JPEG. If you're not going to be pushing your JPEG really far like this, it's not really something you're going to have to worry about. I am just going to an extreme here just to show you kind of the limits of editing a JPEG. Again, we can go to our automatic settings or our default settings. Let's just do automatic real quick. That's a quick edit. That looks pretty good. Here's the before. Let's take a look at this before real quick. Default. And here's the after. That is a quick edit to a JPEG. Not much done here. It's not falling apart, but I really can't take this image very far without it just falling apart and looking like garbage. Whereas with our raw here, let's fit to view. We'll go back to the beginning. Let's just hit auto real quick. That looks great. There's a lot I can do to this. Again, minimal editing. You're always going to want to do as much as you can in camera. I always recommend doing as much as you can in camera to get the image correct. Your white balance, your exposure, everything like that. That just saves time in post-processing later on. But if you are shooting JPEG, you are very limited to what you can do with your JPEG image if you want to edit it later, especially if your image just happens to be a touch overexposed like the image we're showing you here. I am very limited to what I can do with my highlights and my exposure without it looking like mush and losing detail. Whereas again, if I shoot raw and I shoot overexposed, there's quite a bit I can do with my highlights. You can see I can completely conserve my highlights there. There's a lot I can do with my shadows, really bring out that detail in the shadows. That looks really awesome. I can add a lot of contrast and not see any sort of banding or JPEG artifacts up here in these tones. And just the overall color quality, the tones, everything looks so much better. The last thing I want to mention that we mentioned before is sharpness. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in to 200% on this barn. Do the same thing with our JPEG image here, 200% and 200%. And I think it may be hard to tell with YouTube compression in the video, but take my word for it, the NEF RAW file is noticeably sharper. Pay attention here into these trees as I go to the JPEG. A lot of details just lost. It's kind of compressed nothingness here. Same thing with the rocks. And then RAW, just so much more detail. We're going to look over here at the barn, look at these leaves in the RAW, look at this little line of branches here, look at the grass, very tack sharp. Even at 200%, still looks really good. As soon as I go to JPEG, I start losing a lot of that fine detail. The grass turns into mush. The trees don't look as good. And I'm losing some of that texture in the barn. Again, this is the JPEG, the RAW, the JPEG. For me right now, I hope you can see this on the YouTube video. The tone and the tonality is the biggest difference between the RAW and the JPEG. That is what you're losing, that dynamic range, that ability to post-process your image, and sharpness is what you're really losing out with a JPEG compressed file. And this is exactly why I recommend shooting RAW over JPEG. Again, just an overview. Look at the tones of an edited JPEG versus an edited RAW. It looks so much better. That ability to post-process your image and not have it fall apart, to really be an artist and take your image where you want it to go, that's a huge deal. That makes a big difference for me when it comes to RAW versus JPEG. So that's all for this video. I hope you all learned something. I hope you can make a better, more informed decision on whether you should be shooting RAW or JPEG. For me, I am always shooting RAW. I love that data. I love the recovery that I can do if I shoot a little underexposed, a little overexposed. I love that sharpness, especially when it comes to portraits and landscapes, because who doesn't love an ultra sharp image? And there's just so many pros to shooting RAW and not that many cons to shooting RAW these days. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you learned something, be sure to give it a like. If you know a new photographer out there that may be having a struggle or wants to learn the difference between RAW versus JPEG, be sure to share my videos. I really appreciate when you guys share my videos and share my content around the net. So thank you so much for that. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, hit that subscribe button to see more of my photography tips, tricks, and hacks videos. So until next time, get out and go shoot.